Welcome to this special program on Kairali channel. This is a panel conversation between Professor Noam Chomsky of University Professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and two leading experts in the field of the mass media in India, N. Ram, who is editor of Frontline and also editor of Business Line and Sports Star, and Sashi Kumar, the chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which has established in Chennai the Asian College of Journalism. Noam Chomsky is perhaps the world's most renowned academic scholar. He is the founder of the modern science of linguistics. He is a social theorist, activist, a media critic, and author of many books, philosopher, and a great inspiration to people involved in anti-imperialist activism all over the world. I shall not take any further time, in fact, in introducing Professor Chomsky. And the method of this program will be that our two panelists will raise questions to which Professor Chomsky will respond. We will begin with a discussion of the present international situation and crisis in Afghanistan, and go on to discuss other issues and fields with Professor Chomsky. Ram, would you like to begin?
Professor Chomsky, Noam, we are now being told that the evidence has come because it has been widely perceived that the United States and its allies in this new war against terror, that's what it's called, have been unable to produce concrete evidence. But has the situation radically changed with what is reported in the newspapers right now, that the Sunday Telegraph of the UK has obtained a videotape which shows that Osama bin Laden is claiming authorship of the September 11 crimes for himself and Al-Qaeda. Does this make a world of difference in how we should view the situation?
Well, there is, first of all, a small lesson in how to read the newspapers. Disregard the headlines and turn to whatever content there is in the story. I didn't see the videotape, of course, but from the story that has been reported, there's nothing that says we did it, or I did it, or Al-Qaeda did it, or anything of the sort. In fact, the statement that's reported is very familiar. It's what I see every time I turn on BBC and CNN, except that I see it said by Tony Blair or George W. Bush. What they say on television to all of us day after day is there's two kinds of terror. There's the kinds I carry out, which is good terror, and the kind you carry out, which is bad terror. And that's exactly what Osama bin Laden says. He says, two kinds of terror, we do it, it's good terror, you do it, it's bad terror. They are different. Osama bin Laden's not identical to Bush and Blair. He's much more modest. So Osama bin Laden says, we will drive you out of our lands. Blair and Bush also say, we will drive you out of our lands, but they mean different things. Osama bin Laden means Muslim lands. Blair and Bush mean the world or the universe, which is correct. That's their lands. That's the imperial heritage. So they say we will drive evil, namely what we don't like, out of the world. And Osama bin Laden says we will drive evil, what I don't like, out of Muslim lands. But apart from that, you can translate up and back very easily between the two of them. So it's a familiar statement. Another difference, I guess, is that while Bush and Blair are happy to take credit for the terror and violence that they're carrying out, so there's no question about looking for evidence. They're applauding themselves for carrying out the violence. Osama bin Laden basically says nothing. He says, yes, I think it was legitimate, but that's it.
Now, Noam, you've been spending many of your waking hours giving interviews and responding to questions. And I personally find it extremely helpful, the questions you raised and response as an analytical framework. You begin by stating two assumptions about two conditions. Would you like to state that sir, for this discussion?
Well, in the talk that you're referring to, I began by saying that I'm assuming two things. One is that the terrorist acts of September 11th were in fact major crimes, maybe crimes against humanity, as Mary Robinson, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, called them. I think that's reasonable. And the second assumption is that we should be committed to trying to reduce the likelihood of such crimes, not just that one, but many others. And in fact, the context is that there is an ongoing crime which considerably outweighs even the atrocities of September 11th, and that is the crime being committed against the people of Afghanistan. The people living in Kandahar or in villages, they're innocent people. I mean, they didn't carry out the bombing. Whoever carried out the bombing of September 11th, it wasn't them, the attack of September 11th. But they're the ones who were under attack, under severe attack. We don't know the details because when you kill poor, miserable people, nobody counts. It's just normal behavior. But it's very likely, in fact almost certain, that the number of victims of the U.S.-British attack on Afghanistan far exceeds the September 11th crimes. And as it continues, they'll pale into insignificance in comparison. So when we talk about stopping crimes, we do mean terrorist attacks like September 11th, but which is unusual, in fact, historically unique because of the target. I mean, it's the West does this to other people. Other people don't do it to the West. So that's unique. But the ongoing crimes that are being committed right now, which are far more serious, are in fact historically quite normal. That's simply how Europe conquered the world. Now it continues, so no one pays any attention.
You've also spoken about the irrationality, the injustice of the target of the war, and that it's not the people who committed the crime who must face the punishment.
No, in fact, no one even pretends that the people who live in some village in rural Afghanistan committed the crime or even knew about it. They are being targeted because they're weak. They're traditional targets. They're weak, they're poor, they're miserable, they can't fight back, so therefore you destroy them. I mean, there's a long history here. We don't have to, I mean, maybe the most instructive part of the history is right after the First World War. After the Britain, of course, mostly controlled that area, including India at that time. And after the First World War, Britain was no longer in a position to control this huge region by direct force. It had been weakened by the war. So it turned to air power, which was a kind of a new technology at that time. Decided to use air power to try to control the native populations. An interesting series of events took place. The Royal Air Force office in Cairo asked permission from the War Office in London to use air power to deal with what they called recalcitrant Arabs. Arabs is a very broad category, includes anybody, Kurds, Afghans, anyone you like. It went back to Winston Churchill, who was in charge of the War Office. There were the other British embassies didn't like it. The India office thought it was a bad idea. This was right after Amritsar, and they were worried about the reaction in India if Britain started bombing people, poor people all over. Churchill was quite upset. He was angry. He said, I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of, he said, poison gas against uncivilized tribes. The uncivilized tribes he was talking about were Afghans and Kurds. So I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of poison gas against uncivilized tribes. We should use any weapon whatsoever that will save British lives and maintain our control. And poison gas is a very good one because it will inspire a lively terror among these barbarians and enable us to control them. Poison gas at the time was the most horrendous weapon. It was the counterpart to nuclear weapons today. We don't exactly know what happened afterwards. Part of the reason is that no one in England wants to look. These records were declassified, made public about 20 years ago. As soon as I read them, I started writing about them and giving talks about them. There's been no follow-up. Now we can be quite sure we'll never find out. The reason is that the British government 10 years ago declared what they called an open government policy. So now we're going to open up the government to public inspection because we're so democratic. The first act of the open government policy was to remove from the Public Records Office and presumably destroy all records concerning the British use of poison gas and air power to control the uncivilized tribes. So presumably we'll never find out. However, this continued. Throughout the 1920s and the early 30s, Britain continued to rely extensively on aerial bombing of civilians, which was a new terror weapon at the time, to try to control the uncivilized tribes. In fact, I think it was 1932, there was an international conference which tried to, at that time there were many conferences trying to reduce the threat of war and violence. This one was concerned with constraints to prevent the use of air power against helpless civilians. And Britain succeeded in undermining the treaty, and so it never was passed. Lloyd George, a very eminent and respected British statesman, wrote in his diary, this later came out, he was full of praise for the British government for undermining this treaty, and what he said is, we have to reserve the right to bomb the niggers. That's,
in your MIT speech to which Ram referred, you make this, it's actually quite took many people's breath away, that your comparison between the action being taken against Afghanistan and what the sort of analogous response of Britain would have been to the IRA bombing.
Yeah, had they bombed Boston and
I mean, it's, yeah, I mean, with an IRA, the IRA bombings, of course, were not the same scale as the World Trade Center, but they're very serious. Yeah. I mean, one of the bombs attempted to kill the whole British cabinet, not that small. Well, how did Britain respond? Let's put aside questions of feasibility, which of course are significant, but one possible response would have been to bomb Boston, where I live, which happens to be the main source of funding for the IRA. This is the exile diaspora community, which raises money and very militant.
Boston policemen.
Yeah, they're much more, like usual, as is usually the case, diasporas tend to be much more militant than the home country. So the Irish community in Boston and other places is full of fire and wants someone else to do some killing. And they provide the financing, so they have to wipe them out. And then, of course, they should have wiped out West Belfast, where the Catholic community where the IRA is based. Well, that would have been, putting aside feasibility, that would have been criminal idiocy, criminal, really. And of course, it was nothing could be considered. What they did do was sensible.
Yes, when you talk about terrorism, practice and use of terrorism, if I've got you right, you have said that state terrorism, all states are by definition terrorists. It's almost a kind of truism, isn't it?
Almost, because a state is a system of organized violence, operating in the interests of whatever domestic power happens to be. And that quite typically leads to violence and repression. I mean, it's not automatic, but it's historically natural. Right. And the greater and more powerful the state, the more violent it usually is.
Following from that is that no state can normally intervene humanely in a situation like this. I think you have given two exceptions to that. It's interesting because one of them belongs to India. Indian intervention in Bangladesh, you think, is a case
Whatever
of
the motive.
Humane intervention or humane consequence.
Humane consequence. We have to be distinct.
True, yeah.
I mean, there are examples of humane consequences.
Not intended.
So say destroying Hitler was a good consequence, but it wasn't the intention. Yeah, or Vietnam invading Cambodia to eliminate Pol Pot, or India invading to stop the terror in East Pakistan. I mean, these were actions that had humane consequences, but they don't count as humanitarian interventions. They were not undertaken out of benevolence. They were undertaken out of power interests, and they happen to have humane consequences.
Yes. And yet you, of late, you are talking about a space for a paternalistic state, a state which can have a role in protecting its people. What space or how much space would you give the state?
Well, I wouldn't give the state any space. People have a capacity to protect themselves, and sometimes they, in our system of governance, the only, I don't think it's the best possible way, but the way that exists is through participation in a quasi-democratic process in which people can organize protection for themselves, like water facilities, or
Social Security,
health service, or Social Security, or education, or self-defense. You know, that insofar as the state represents a mechanism by which people acting for themselves can cooperate as a community to achieve some communal end, that's okay. I don't happen to think that this apparatus is the best way of doing it, but it's the one we have. On the other hand, that does not accord the state any rights whatsoever. I mean, the state as an entity has no rights, zero. It's as a representative, insofar as it's a representative of the population, then it has the rights. It represents the interests and choices, democratic choices of the population. That's legitimate. But the state has no rights. And if the state acts on its own, as it can't.
Noam, if I could take you back to the new war against terror, focused on war on Afghanistan. Going back to your analytical framework, question number one, what's happening right now? I think there's a very interesting, you put the emphasis on mass starvation as a method, what you call silent genocide, because the people are rightly concerned about killing of civilians, what the Pentagon calls collateral damage. But this aspect, I think, has got relatively little attention, although aid agencies may be sensitive.
It's gotten relatively little attention by the choice of the propaganda system. The decision of the propaganda system, including BBC, CNN, the New York Times, and so on, is to deflect attention away from the atrocities that are happening to marginal atrocities. That's quite typical. So take, say, the Vietnam War. There was tremendous focus on the My Lai massacre. It was a horrible massacre. A few hundred people were killed by some half-crazed, half-educated GIs and soldiers in the field who didn't know what was happening to them, and they did commit a massacre. That massacre happened to be a marginal, tiny footnote to a mass murder operation called Operation Wheeler Wallawa, which was a mass terror operation, one of many, designed to basically wipe out the rural and demolish the rural population, which was the basis for the resistance to the United States. Now, there is no discussion of the mass murder operation. Actually, there's some. I wrote about it when the data came out, but that's not discussed. What's discussed is this little footnote, which you can blame on some poor soldiers in the field who probably didn't know who was going to shoot at them next. You don't blame the people sitting in the air-conditioned offices targeting B-52 raids on villages and organizing these mass murder operations. And it's the same here. Attention is...
What are the estimates of the number of people at risk, you think?
Well, the estimates mostly come from the United Nations, other World Food Organization, other Food and Agricultural Organization, and others, and many aid agencies, Oxfam and so on, and they're pretty consistent. Everyone pretty much agrees. And in fact, the press also agrees when it reports it. Prior to the bombing, there was a serious, prior to September 11th, the situation was quite serious. There were maybe 5 or 6 million people in Afghanistan who were just on the edge of starvation and were being sustained by international food aid. After September 11th, immediately there was a threat of bombing, and people were terrified, naturally. Many people started fleeing into the countryside. The international organizations removed their international workers, so the only ones they had left were local workers. On September 16th, so 5 days later, the United States essentially ordered Pakistan to terminate food deliveries into Afghanistan. That was the main source of the food coming in. It was interesting that there was no reaction to that in the West. The day after that, I happened to be on radio and television all over Europe, which I did for several months. And I asked everywhere I spoke, Germany, England, I asked, is there any reaction to this? And there was no reaction anywhere, because that's normal. It's normal for it, and it's correct that there's no reaction. This is the normal behavior of the West towards its victims. We want to starve them to death, we starve them to death. So it doesn't require any.
I think this is a major issue that needs to be flagged.
And then it continues. I mean, it
silent,
continues. By the estimates, to get to your point, by the end of the month, by the end of September, the estimates were that the number of people subject to, on the verge of starvation and needing immediate aid had risen by 50%. So that's an extra 2.5 million people, just as a result of the threat of bombing. The agencies warned that if there's actual bombing, it's going to become much worse, of course. When the bombing took place, even the limited amount of food that was coming in was terminated. It later picked up to an extent, but nowhere near the former level. Winter's coming. You know, as soon as winter's coming, most of the large parts of the country are impassable. Can't get aid to people. When people flee to the countryside, first, there's 2 points to be made about the fleeing. First of all, the attacks on the cities are basically a form of biological warfare. When you bomb a city and you destroy its electrical supplies and its water supplies and its sewage supplies, that's a polite way of saying biological warfare. You can imagine
contamination.
That's, you know, yes, of course. And the main cities, Kandahar, Herat, and others, probably 3/4 of the population fled. When they flee to the countryside, they're fleeing to the most heavily mined area in the world. There were mine clearing operations. They had to be terminated because of the threat of bombing. So it's worse than it was before. And furthermore, now there are US cluster bombs all over the place, which are much worse than landmines. I mean, these are murderous anti-personnel weapons designed to kill people, not to harm a tank. You know. And they're all over the place, and they're impossible to eliminate. It requires technical knowledge that the Pentagon won't provide in order to remove them. They're all over the world, in Laos and other places. So now people are fleeing into areas which are extremely dangerous. The food agencies, so the World Food Program and the Red Cross and others, have warned that the airdrops are extremely dangerous because they draw people to places which might be very dangerous to go into. Aside from the fact that if you drop food somewhere, it's not going to go to women and children and so on. I mean, you know, men will pick it up and take it to the bazaar and sell
French
it.
television had this program
of course, what's going to happen.
where the Northern Alliance troops comes in, clears the place of the yellow food
and
parcels,
sells them in the bazaar.
and then the others come with donkeys and carry the cardboard out
What's
as
going to
fuel.
happen? And the World Food Program, particularly in the Red Cross, did say that there are circumstances under which airdrops are legitimate, but what you have to do is clear an area, have local people there, your own people there, inform the population that this is a safe area, and drop food in places where there's an organization, and you can give it to the people who need it. You know, to people who are sick, or women, or children, and so on. Well, this is just a propaganda operation. It's received scathing condemnations from the aid agencies. But this whole process is killing an enormous number of people. Now, the details we don't know because nobody looks. But as compared with, what's being looked at is what you said, the so-called collateral damage. So occasionally a bomb hits the wrong target, and then everyone goes and says, isn't it terrible, we hit the wrong target. Well, you know, a bomb will hit the wrong target, so that's an accident.
Part of the game.
Part of the game. But this is purposeful murderous slaughter of probably millions of people.
It's misleading to look at collateral damage.
Yeah, it's totally misleading.
Or give it too much weight.
It's a marginal consequence. It's like My Lai as compared with the mass murder operation.
But there are two issues there which have appeared in Noam's work. One is to give too much prominence to one incident, and not see the entire context. There's yet another, a methodological point, which he always makes, is that when you assess the deaths caused by an attack, you don't assess the number of people who died in that incident. No? Because if 5 people die when you destroy a pharmaceutical factory, and that pharmaceutical factory is producing life-saving drugs for millions of people, then those millions must count as part of the victims of that bomb.
It's like starvation
Yeah,
deaths,
exactly.
starvation
So,
related.
exactly. So it's, and I think this has, of course, appeared in your recent controversy with, with Christopher Hitchens.
Hitchens, yes.
That you don't just measure the number of people who die then, but or look at Iraq.
Direct
Iraq,
line.
you know, it's not just the people who died in '91, but the many millions who died since then.
And that's all over the world. I mean, take, say, Laos, one of the poorest countries in the world. In the late 1960s, there was what was called a secret bombing of northern Laos. It was secret because the media knew all about it and refused to print it. And I can tell you that from personal experience, from meetings with the editorial board of the New York Times and Time Life and so on. The information was there, they would not print it. I happened to be there shortly after and interviewed refugees and so on. This was bombing in northern Laos, had nothing to do with the Indochina wars. The government admitted that. It's a poor peasant area with, which at that time was became the most heavily bombed area in the world. Now, right now, by now there are millions, literally millions of unexploded, what are called bomblets, you know, the little pieces of cluster bombs that don't explode. There's about a 20–30% failure rate, presumably in order to kill more people. Now, if a child picks up one of these little things, flechettes come out and murder him. If a farmer hits one with a hoe, same thing. There are literally millions of them. Now, the number of people dying in northern Laos is not really known, but the aid workers, church volunteer demining groups, I mean, they estimate thousands killed a year. In fact, the Asian Wall Street Journal, their Asia correspondent, Barry Wayne, he accepted the figure of 10,000 deaths a year as possible. You know, he didn't say it's true, he said it could be possible. Well, that's going on right now. You know, this is more than 30 years after the war's over. There's a British demining team, a volunteer demining team trying to deal with it. The Pentagon, to this day, will not give them technical information about how to defuse the unexploded bomblets. Well, these are all casualties of the Vietnam War. You know, the Vietnam War may be over, but these people are still dying. I mean, the people still dying from cancer because of chemical warfare in the South, you know, they're dying.